Hey, what's up, y'all? So today I want to try and be as fast as possible. I was messing around my camera to prep for a near shoot, just to kind of, you should prep anyways for your camera. But basically, I wanted to kind of give you guys my thought process on how I learned or how I was able to practice a lot of this stuff when it comes to daylight interiors and just different setups. So one of the hardest things in New York City is you have to, let's say, have a space where you can practice. And if I'm being honest, most people who live in New York City, your apartments are probably small, or you live with somebody else, or you just don't have the room for it. New York City is not like having a house or a rental property that you live on that has enough space. This is New York City. So what do? Well, one thing I learned is if you can practice concepts, then you can understand the fundamentals and apply it to a real life scene. So even though there's no subject in the frame right now, let's kind of just go over how would you approach this. So let's say you're going for a daylight interior shot. You have a window in the shot. It's clipped. You can clearly see in the image right now that it's clipped. Well, okay, the settings you have are pretty much what you want. You want 24 frames, your shutter angle, shutter speed is where you need it to be. Your ISO is where you want it to be. It's exactly where you need it to be. But your windows are still clipped. Well, obviously that means one of two things. Either you can ND the window down, which if you're just now starting out, that's probably not something you have access to, or you can ND down your camera. It's more than likely you're going to ND down your camera. So let's do that. Now, this camera that I'm using is a Mavo Edge 8K, so I get I get ND built into it, variable ND. And these are really good NDs. Okay. So now that we've ND'd down, you see now we have all that information back in our highlights, in our windows. But what have we noticed about the image overall that isn't the windows is the image is darker. And even though the image is darker, we want to preserve as much information indoors. So what does that mean you have to do? Based on the amount of stops that you have on your camera, you might be able to pull this back in post. But for clean inside interior, minimal noise, the best option to do is to lift the ambient tone of the room inside. Now, when you're doing so, be mindful of how much light is coming out of the window in this shot right here. So you see how bright the window is? Keep that in mind. It's still pretty bright, but it's not clipped, which means we can work with it. So we're gonna bring up the ambience a little bit and see how it looks. Okay, so now that you see that we brought up the ambience a little bit, I'm using just something very simple. I'm just bouncing a Forza 60B into the ceiling, just so we can get a little bit more room tone. Now, what did it do to the image? We're able to keep all the information in our highlights. So we have the building in the background. We're not missing any information, but then also we're able to lift the ambience and keep as much information in the room as possible. Now, like I said, you have to keep in mind when you're doing this, you can't overexpose the room tone too much. Doing so is going to look very sourcey. It's going to look like it's not really being lit by the windows, and people are going to be able to tell that there's an internal source in the room. So you have to make sure when you're doing this, measure how much light you have in the scene, make sure your monitor is accurate as possible, be mindful of how much light you're throwing back into the room, and make sure it looks like it's organically coming from the window. So I don't want to drag this on any longer than it has to be. I wanted this to be very quick, simple, understanding, and just to summarize, when you're exposing for your windows, try your best to expose the windows just a little below clipping. So maybe if I use a chart that's on my small HD, so before it hits 100, make sure you're peaking your max highlights probably at like 95 or 90. So that way you leave yourself a little bit of headroom. Then once you have all the information for your windows down, then lift your ambience inside, but make sure that the amount of light you're throwing back into the room ambience, matches what's at least seemingly coming from the window. If it's too bright, it'll look artificially lit, and people will not believe that the scene is being lit by the window. If it's too dark, you're gonna need more exposure. So it's not as simple as I made it seem, it comes with practice, but just be mindful when you're kind of doing this stuff. Check your monitor, see how it looks, check your levels, check your scopes, do what you have to do. use EL zone. Doesn't matter what you use to measure the amount of light that you're not only reducing from the windows, but also make sure you keep being mindful of how much light you're putting back into the room as well. So I appreciate y'all. Hope you enjoyed a simple little thing that I thought about, and I'll holler at y'all later.